Welcome to Acquire Connected, a podcast that is your compass in the world of data across environmental, social and governance.
Welcome to the second season of the Acquire Connected podcast. This podcast features interviews with thought leaders and technology experts who are tackling data management challenges in the geoscientific, environmental and social performance industries and their impacts on the Earth's resources, the natural environment and the communities around them. I'm Jamie Nobbs, your host for this podcast, and today we sit down with Stuart Vanderwater, Environmental Lead at Acquire, and Daniel Woodcock, Partner Manager of EnviroSys at Acquire. In this episode, we're looking at how companies can get their environmental data ready and organised for 2025. We reflect on how companies have and perhaps haven't managed their data so well, how the industry has evolved this year, and then some steps that companies can take to get their data ready for 2025 and beyond. Let's get into it. Thank you both for joining this podcast episode. Now, Stu, this isn't your first time on the podcast, but Daniel, are we calling you Woody on this episode or Daniel?
Either or. Everyone calls me Woody.
We'll go with Woody. Woody, it is yours. So perhaps we can start by, if you could introduce yourself, who you are and what you do at Acquire.
Yep, sure. So Daniel Woodcock is my real name. Everyone calls me Woody. I've been with EnviroSys for a bit over 20 years now. Everything from implementing the system and training users and helping our clients get the best out of the solution. And I'm now responsible for the overall implementation of EnviroSys to all of our new clients, along with managing the EnviroSys service desk based here in Adelaide.
And how about yourself, Stu? Would you like to, for people that perhaps haven't heard you speak before, would you be able to give yourself a little bit of an introduction?
No worries, Jamie. Yeah, Stuart Vanderwater, or Stu as I'm known, have also been with EnviroSys for 20 years, probably only slightly longer than Woody, but not much. And I head up the environmental value stream within Acquire, and specifically the EnviroSys product.
Thank you both for introducing yourselves. What we're going to be talking about today is looking into the future. Not that that's very far away, considering we're coming into Christmas now. So if we start by looking at perhaps the year that we've just had, Stu, you've been to IMARC, and Woody, you've spoken to a number of customers throughout the year as well. What trends are you both seeing in the environmental space, particularly when it comes to the mining and resources sector, and how potentially has this changed from previous years?
Yeah, thanks, Jamie. It's interesting because water management is definitely front of mind at the moment. You sort of see that come out in the conferences and various papers, probably even more so than emissions and decarbonisation. ESG has really dominated in the last few years and has really tended to monopolise the conversation, especially if you go to conferences last year and the like, and you get some of the studies that are coming out. I think as everyone's now become organised and trying to get that under control, water management and probably more specifically, the term water stewardship has really become a trend now. Or not really a trend, I guess it's putting a spotlight back onto just how much or how important it is to manage water on site.
And why do you think that is? From what I've seen, people are moving away from the term ESG and more towards that environmental stewardship and water stewardship. Why do you think there is that change?
I think out of all the different types of environmental aspects that we manage, water's the one that's scarce. You can't make it up. It is a rather scarce commodity, and it's really very important how we manage that on site. And it's not just how we manage on site, it's the inputs and the outputs. The clever ways that we can manage the water on site really makes a massive impact to the way that we're operating.
And it's not just about the water use on site. Obviously, they use it for a variety of things, dust suppression and the like, but then, of course, it's drinking water as well for all the FIFO people in the camp accommodation. So there's a huge safety aspect there, and it's critical that they get the management and the testing of that water correct.
Is this something that you're seeing globally as well, or is it in particular areas?
No, I think definitely globally. It's more of a challenge in the remote areas for sure, but yeah, it's definitely a global challenge.
And it's funny, you might think it's only really applicable for those areas which struggle with water. So not enough water, but even having too much water can be an issue as well, and how you actually manage too much water on site as well. And We even think some of our operations that are maybe in more tropical places, massive rain events have a pretty big impact to the environment. So being able to keep a really good track of those and how do we utilise that sort of water is also quite important.
And then on the other end of the scale, when we're talking about our North American clients, when the water freezes in the winter months, that was a big eye-opener for us, and trying to understand how they deal with that and manage that.
You've definitely got the whole spectrum there, from remote areas of Western Australia through to the water freezing around sites in Canada. That's an interesting challenge. I guess, what are some of the risks or the challenges that you're actually seeing companies face at the moment when it comes to environmental data that you expect to see maybe carry on into the future? So I believe that's probably an issue that will continue on into the future, but are there any other, I guess, risks or challenges?
Yeah, the risks and challenges are pretty universal, I guess, and it really does relate to the nature of the beast. And that's managing the environmental data is so multidisciplinary and multifaceted. So we have to manage data right across all the broad variety of environmental factors with a multitude of collection methods and frequencies and formats. So orchestrating that can be pretty risky and prone to errors if done manually, or even if part of it's done manually. So the challenge will always be there, but the risk doesn't have to be there as long as companies are pretty organised, diligent and consistent. They need to be really holistic in their thinking, and preferably using, of course, a system like EnviroSys is great to be able to manage all of their different data challenges.
Yeah, and over the years we've seen just an ever-increasing volume of data that people are managing. That's due to more demanding permits and approvals that have been legislated on. There's advances in communications and the IoT space, so organisations are just receiving more and more data these days, and so it's an ever challenging environment that we're in to manage all of that data. And as Stu said, the sheer breadth of data and then the volume and the amount of data coming in, it's always going to be a big challenge.
No, you've raised some interesting points there about just the volume and the complexity of data. Has that just come with the advancement of technology, do you think, or is there other reasons that people are collecting more data than ever before?
Yeah, I think it's both of those reasons. The volume of data. When we first started implementing EnviroSys 20 years ago, there were not many weather loggers and dust loggers and water loggers out there. Sure, some of the sites had a few, but I think with the improvements in communication and the reduction in cost of those machines and the communication, they're just becoming more prevalent these days. And we're talking, instead of taking one sample a week, people are getting one reading every 15 minutes, for example. So it's just a huge increase in the volume of data coming in.
And do you see that as necessary? Do you think there's a point where people are collecting too much data, or do you think it is a really important thing for people to be now collecting data at such a frequent rate?
Yeah, I think they'll only integrate or install these loggers at those real key locations where they do need that near real-time data, so they can see at a glance what's happening in that location. So flow volumes, for example, they can see when they've got lots of water flowing. They can get instantaneous readings on their dust levels in around their sites, and in particular in around their accommodation areas. So yeah, definitely very important to have that access to that real-time data.
And I guess those advancements really ensure that companies can move from just purely doing the stuff for reporting and compliance to being able to look at this stuff in real time and make decisions in real time. I guess that's where we've seen a really good progression in the industry from, we're just doing it because we have to and we'll just report every month or every quarter to the government, to, no, we actually do more intelligent analysis around what's going on, and we can potentially mitigate risks and also look at improvements for optimising our operations. So I think it's actually given people a really good advantage on how they can manage site operations.
And in terms of how that will move into the future, how do you predict, or how are you seeing companies actually scale their data management systems to be able to adapt to the current demands of how much people are collecting, and also into the future? We don't know how that's going to change with the advancement of technology. So yeah, how would you say companies are starting to scale their operations to meet the demand of the amount of data they're collecting?
Yeah, I think when we talk about that, it's almost like a proliferation of data and just the expansion, it really does underline that they need to be really well organised to manage this sort of thing, because even though they will get this big data, they'll still have, I guess, what you could call little data with regards to a lot of the analysis that's coming from labs and the like and consultants. So that data is still really important for regulation and obligations sitting alongside that frequency of data. So as the volume sort of explodes and scales, we still need to make sure that we're looking at that sort of data too. And you really need to be able to then do that in one spot, which I think is really key. Otherwise, you're having different systems manage different types of data, trying to pull that together for an overall view of compliance, and then be able to utilise those sort of data sets together becomes really difficult if they aren't organised and they don't have that sort of platform in place.
Yeah, and understanding, getting back to that question earlier about, is it necessary to have all this data coming in? We probably do see a lot of data coming in and that they're purely loading that data for the sake of it, but you need to have that understanding of why we are collecting this data. And once we've got it in, what do we need to do with it to actually get something out of it? If you're just pumping in data every 15 minutes, it's just data, it's not information. So how can you then convert that data into information, aggregate that up to the site level, or doing your comparisons across other data sets from other systems, and that leads into integration space. So you really need to have a really good understanding of how to convert that into information to make it useful.
That's a really good point, Woody. And but there's a balance as well. It's really also not letting the tail wag the dog. And what I mean by that is that we have seen occurrences where people get so fixated on how we utilise that internal information, it really does skew how people organise the data as well. Then they have this sort of blind spot of things they may not be collecting or doing too well, but they don't really care because it's not related to exactly the thing that they're doing. So now we are generating these large data sets. We are finding people who are not just doing it for the sake of having to do it because of their regulatory requirements, but they're looking at things like, changes to emissions reporting and, sustainability and decarbonisation targets in, 25 and beyond, that know that they need to collect this data. They sometimes don't know exactly what, but they're trying to make sure that they collect it now. So by the time things come in and become a little bit more solidified in the exact requirements, they're not going, oh no, we haven't got that data. I really wish we were doing that before. So some people are hedging their bets a little bit and loading that data. And Woody's right, sometimes it does create a lot of noise. But I guess that's where having really good procedures and frameworks around going, this is the stuff that is important, and being able to access that quickly without getting caught up in the noise of everything else.
I like what you said there about turning data into information, and also what is information that you need to be reporting on versus what is data that you're just collecting potentially for the future, but you're not really sure yet. Stu, you've also raised some of the changes that are coming up. We are moving into an era of, I guess, climate change awareness. From a community perspective, there's a lot more scrutiny. Companies are having much more stringent sustainability goals. There's a lot more scrutiny again around blue washing and greenwashing. And we've also got some emissions reporting coming into play, particularly in Australia, I believe, next year. What are some of the key considerations that companies should be thinking about when it comes to managing their environmental data leading into next year, where we are starting to see more regulatory requirements from companies?
Yeah, like I mentioned before, it's about being organised now and being a bit of, in some ways, mind readers about some things that are coming in. Like most people have got a pretty good idea of what the requirements are getting organised now is actually probably too late. Getting organised a little while ago would have been better. But thankfully, a lot of customers have, they'll report on, and you'll see studies around that to say that most of them think that they're keeping up. There's a few that aren't, and I guess that's where the big gaps happen. When it comes to, say, getting into emissions reporting, because a lot of it is around, decarbonisation and targets and those sort of things too, really ensuring that things are integrated is really key, because emission reporting, and I guess it's bringing that into the equation when we talk about environmental reporting. A lot of the data can come from other places and other systems. So that integration and orchestration is absolutely paramount. And so if you're not doing that well, it can really impede your reporting really significantly. And that means a lot of time and money wasted. And also not to mention the stress that it causes on those actually trying to perform this sort of reporting too.
Now, I want to talk about the integration, but before I do that, I do want to ask, in terms of perhaps it'll be easier to speak to the customers that you've spoken to. But in general, how are you seeing companies currently tracking their sustainability goals? And do you expect that to evolve?
Yeah, I think they definitely are improving, and we've seen great improvements over the years. Typically, our customers are doing that through spreadsheets. That's been pretty common over the last sort of decade, collating data from various systems into their wonderful spreadsheet, which has got 30 different tabs on it that they're then trying to work with to hit their sustainability goals and manage it that way. We've seen a pretty big increase in uptake in integration into the likes of Power BI and other BI systems and Tableau and the like, which makes it a lot more robust in terms of pulling data in from your various systems, and it's a lot more real time. And obviously, it comes with all your change management. If you're storing all your data in EnviroSys or the like, then you've got your complete change history there as well, and you don't have issues with incorrect formulas and the like. So yes, definitely seeing a big uptake in that area, trying to move away from spreadsheets, which is great.
Yeah, I think though the way that companies do approach it though is still a little bit based on the outcomes. So they are still we have to do sustainability reporting, so we're going to send it from all the operations to a central person or a central system. They'll perform the reporting and it's all good. So it feels a lot very much after the fact. It feels pretty much as an exercise in data aggregation and even in accounting. What we're seeing though with the likes of, say, you mentioned greenwashing, a lot of those sort of terms come out of what is the actual investment or dedication of companies to becoming better environmental stewards, and the sustainability becoming like a real end-to-end idea that it really does get looked at every stage of the life cycle. So it's not just sort of a thing we report on and go, oh, here's how we're going. I think there is a movement now for people going, no, we have to do this from the grassroots level, to how we are actually monitoring the sort of best practices that we're doing, having availability to that data so we can see what's happening in real time, so we can mitigate things going wrong. And this is where I think we're looking at the sort of systems that we're using as well, and the way that we do things. We have to take it away from a reporting or an activity of reporting to actively managing. So I think most people sort of stop and going, we've seen some exceedances, we've raised some alerts, we've done some things, we've reported it, to what do we do in response to that? Like, it's really important to know that we did something that happened to a critical event and we had actions and workflow to say, look, we did detect that, but this is what we did proactively or sometimes reactively, but in a good, timely manner to ensure that it wasn't something systemic that's an issue. For me, that's really looking at sustainability across the chain, and having, the processes and integrated systems that can help that is a big advantage for companies.
Yeah, it means they can spend more time actually analysing their data and making those decisions, rather than trying to manage the data and wrangle it and aggregate it at the end of the reporting period.
It's really fascinating to hear actually how, it's not just the collection of data and reporting on that information, but it's also then what happens next. How do companies then actually make decisions and move past whatever the critical event was to make sure that it doesn't happen again, or that people are safe, or whatever it is. In terms of EnviroSys customers, you've spoken a bit there about how companies have been reporting on their sustainability goals in the past. If you were to look at some of the EnviroSys customers now, what would you say are the best ways that people are tracking their sustainability goals within EnviroSys? Or how are people using EnviroSys to track their sustainability goals in a way that you see better than something like spreadsheets and Power BI?
I think a lot of it is ensuring you have all the facts first, and then looking at, what does sustainability goal mean? Often it's based around targets, limits, things that we want to achieve or move to. So, the simplistic ones are, rolling data up, aggregating data across your sites and ensuring that it meets sort of high-level indicators. So, some of our customers have, say, what would you call it, corporate reporting type schemes in the system where they'll, every month or every quarter, they'll be rolling up data to, say, an operation level to say, well, these are the high-level sustainability indicators which are important. That's got some sort of change built in. So if there are large variances, then, we're asking customers to put in some commentary around why that is. And I guess when you start embedding those sort of behaviours, that becomes front of mind for people. So it's not just a reporting thing. They're going, oh, well, we also need to make sure that when these things aren't varying, because large variances, some of them can be seasonal, but some of them can be in response to some event, which, probably wasn't too great. And if you're finding these things out after the fact, then that's always can be detrimental to anything that we're recording or reporting on.
Yeah, that's right. And if you look at sustainability targets, they're typically these 12 months, same as your greenhouse gas reporting. It's a 12-month reporting scheme. But I think that the best cases we've seen is obviously doing that regularly, doing that monthly to keep on top of it, but also keeping it simple as well. We developed this, what we thought was an amazing dashboard for a client recently that had 6 or 7 different pages and all these targets and indicators and graphs, and it was great. And the client said, yeah, that looks pretty, but all we need is really emissions intensity per tonne of ore across our sites, just really simple. So, all right, we've pared it down, and now that's their main tool that they use to track their intensity and track how they're going towards their targets, and just keeping it really simple, clear and concise.
That's a really good point, Woody, that the ones that are doing it well, and even though that particular customer said we just want to see that sort of annual or aggregated view, they had the data, they had that ability to track that month on month and really manage it in a far more real-time manner than a lot of other people that we observe.
Yep. Reporting internally is one aspect, but if we also consider external reporting or reporting to the community around a mine site or a local community of any sort, if we look at data transparency and sharing companies' environmental data strategies or results, how can companies strike a balance between the openness or the transparency of their environmental reporting and, say, something like data security, which is becoming more of a challenge, I guess, for a lot of companies?
Yeah, the transparency needs to play a huge role, but you are right. There is a balance between, what you'd say maybe outward and inward transparency. So companies really only tend to share what they need to or what they're obligated to outwardly, but inwardly they need to be really bulletproof in the data management practices. So thinking about, sort of data security, data governance, auditability, all of those sort of things in between. Disclosure is a non-negotiable these days. When it comes to any environmental claims you're doing, you need to be able to show your workings. It's just super important to be able to ensure that everything is in place that has those security checks in as well. So, and I guess Woody could probably talk to this as well. With every time we engage with a customer now, there's pretty extensive cybersecurity questionnaires that we need to fill out. And as a company, we've also ensured that our company security stance and ISO alignment and certifications come along as well, because companies won't want to deal with vendors that don't have that in place, because it is a large material risk for them.
Yeah, that's for sure. The actual act of sharing the data can be really time consuming as well and problematic. Often we see, these data requests come in and customers are scrambling to first understand what they're allowed to share externally, and then secondly, trying to collate all that data and cleanse it, make sure there's no gaps, make sure it's then suitable for sharing. Can be quite a big challenge. So it's really important that you've got strong data management foundations so you can almost systemize those decisions, so you can easily flag what data is available to be shared. It makes it a lot less painful when you need to share that data, and even makes it possible to potentially automate some of that sharing of data.
It's a really, really good point when it comes to being organised, and we have mentioned greenwashing a couple of times, and in whatever guise that is, most people will think of that as a deliberate act, but often it can be an indeliberate act, like through just not having things organised or just misstating things because of errors in spreadsheets or those sort of things, mismanagement of data. That's still greenwashing. That is still something that people can be penalised for. And people, I don't think, realise that. Everyone thinks it's a deliberate act of misleading. No, not necessarily. So it just highlights that people need to be so organised and, like I said, be able to show their workings and be able to, like Woody said, take people's judgment out of it, and to the point where it's systematised, you should be able to just back the things that are sitting there without having to say, we better check it all first just to make sure it's right.
I guess that also raises questions around if you are integrating, or if you've got data coming in from a range of different sources, making sure that the data is correct. How important is something like data interoperability and ensuring that the data is robust enough?
We wouldn't have many customers if we didn't have a good focus on integration and interoperability. You have to be able to play well with others to be able to not only ingest data from other places, but also be able to share data. And the best way to do that is ensure that you are using industry standard mechanisms for that, utilising schemes or structures that have been designated by regulatory authorities, for example. But also when data comes in, you need to make sure that it always goes through the similar rigor. So you can't have data coming from labs or devices or being manually entered into your system that are all going through these wonderful data governance processes, but then you're bringing in data from another system and it just goes straight into the database without any checks. Everything really needs to be pretty transparent when it comes to how we check that data, because we do want to trust the data coming from another place is of quality, but you can't take that for granted. So I think even though you need to be able to pass data around all the time, you still need to make sure that there's data governance and quality checking at all parts of it.
Yeah, and that having that really solid foundation is not just critical for integrating with other systems and pulling data in and pushing data out and sharing. It's also really important internally as well, especially for like a multi-site organisation. It's critical that all the sites have got that consistent, strong structure and foundation. It makes then sharing data between sites a lot more simple, but then also rolling data up and aggregating it up to the corporate level means that corporate can then trust the data coming in from sites and it's all in a consistent format as well.
Yeah, and to even go further on that as well, if you can actually look at why you're collecting the data, so looking at the compliance obligations and conditions and trying to ensure that if that is a lot of the reason why we're collecting these things, and notwithstanding potentially other frameworks that are coming out, having it organised around that makes it a lot easier to do those sort of things that Woody was just talking about. If it isn't organised well enough, then you are spending a lot of time making assumptions and aggregating data potentially in not a very organised way or way that allows you to share data in that sort of open, transparent manner.
So I've got one more question for you guys, and you've actually touched on a few things that I think you probably mentioned in this question about being organised and keeping the reporting simple. But you also mentioned that companies should either already be doing this, or if they haven't, they probably need to get a wriggle on with a lot more regulatory reporting coming up. But if we look ahead into the future, this can be as near as 2025 or longer term, what would you advise companies to do now to ensure that they're actually prepared for managing their environmental data well going into the new year?
I think it's a mindset. It's around that full, you'd almost call it a data lifecycle. So how it needs to be used, where it's coming from, how it gets transformed is really important. Having that mindset of always thinking, can I prove it? Or stating another way, I heard this recently at IMARC, is being aware of the say-do gap. So is what we're saying what we're actually doing, and can we prove it? So issues occur when that say-do gap is large. Being able to disclose what's happening, why it's happened, and to be able to back it up is super important. That's what's going to be really looked at when it comes to a lot of litigation. So that is becoming a far more prevalent. A lot of government bodies and even independent bodies looking at statements being made by large mining companies around their environmental performance are going to be heavily scrutinised. They are now, and in the future, like nothing before. So it's really having that mindset all the time going, is this all defensible? I know that seems like a really defensive way to do it, and probably in some contradiction to, trying to utilise these things on site, but you still have to have that idea to say, yeah, we can utilise these things in a real-time manner to help improvements, but we also need to make sure that everything we're doing is aligned and provable. So, and we also see a lot of these situations being based on people doing a really good job. So, that's where things can fall down. So they have all the best planning, but then the processes don't come along as well. So we find that, technology is great. You can throw technology at it, but that's only a piece of the puzzle. If you don't look at your processes, how that works business as usual, what do you do when things go wrong? And change management is huge. So we see the biggest gaps in data, the biggest issues with consistent auditable reporting is, well, that person left, and so now this person's been doing it a different way, or even from shift to shift, people can do it differently. So we do like to say we need to people-proof these things to a certain element, but it also helps the people doing it. So it's really well defined. They have a lot less stress around what they need to be doing. A lot of it does become a little bit more mechanical. To what Woody said before, to be able to systematize things as much as possible, to automate, so people don't have to make these decisions or calls on things. It's just part of what you do in the framework that you have.
And I think I can't stress this enough, but one of the most critical aspects of the people, the process, and the technology is that combination of the three, but making sure you are keeping on top of your data management processes and practices, having that constant review and audit of your data that's coming in and your data processes. Far too often we see companies scrambling towards the end of a reporting cycle to try and get all their data in, and they've realised there's a large gap, 6 months ago, because for whatever reason the data didn't come in from the data source. So they're scrambling to play catch up and to pull those gaps of data in, and there's a whole bunch of unvalidated data that hasn't been reviewed yet. It's far easier to pick up and resolve a data issue as it happens rather than 6 months down the track when it's completely gone from your memory. So that's a real critical aspect, not just moving forward, but now hugely critical for making sure you're on top of all your legislative requirements to ease that burden when that time comes.
Yeah, so planning now for the future, not just reacting to new reporting as it comes up. Yeah.
But it is easier said than done, because there's such a large volume of work that environmental professionals need to be doing to keep up with this sort of thing. It's easy for us to say, get organised, but that's where resourcing comes into it. So people do have the time and the breathing space to get organised. But then this is where we see on site a lot of people who are super stressed, that are under-resourced and don't have the time to properly do this. So I guess, coming in, and we'd like to hope that we help provide some of that breathing space, that we can provide some of that automation, some of those platform things, but also experience around change management too. So the best projects we ever do is when the customer is also really organised and they have change management and they have a real dedication to ensure that this thing doesn't only just answer their data management questions, but also helps transform habits and behaviours on site, so that these things are sustainable in the future.
I think that's a pretty good place to leave it there. I think you've given people a lot of information about what they should be considering now, how companies are doing it well and perhaps not so well, and how I guess you're seeing the industry kind of changing to evolve with more environmental reporting coming into play. So I think we'll leave it there. Thank you both so much for sitting down and recording this with me.
All right. Thanks, Jamie.
Thanks, Jamie.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Acquire Connected. If you enjoyed today's episode and want to keep up to date on the latest episodes on tackling your data management challenges, then please hit subscribe. If you want to support the podcast, we'd love for you to like and follow the episode on whichever podcast player you're listening to right now. See you next week on Acquire Connected.
Thanks for listening to the Acquire Connected podcast channel. Find us at acquire.com.au.